Welcome to Melbourne CocoaHeads 184. This is going to be a great night. Awesome. Yes. Okay. In the spirit of reconciliation, Melbourne CocoaHeads acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders. Oh God. Okay. I thought you would just give it to me. I'll tell you not.
No, probably not.
Press tab. Can we rewind?
I don't get anything late.
Nah, we'll just go for this. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. So when I was doing sibilance, and hearing nothing is okay. In the spirit of reconciliation, I should go back to the beginning. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Melbourne. Okay. Yeah. Let's just edit this out. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Melbourne CocoaHeads 184. Kira, yeah, thank you. Beautiful. All right. In the spirit of reconciliation, Melbourne CocoaHeads acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Yes. Okay, tonight we have an awesome show. Vita Milano is going to kick things off with developing optimism, positive psychology, and software development. And then Amy Dells will finish things off with the girl on the Swift test. A look at the adventures had when writing unit tests in Swift and the fun that can be had doing so. Okay, give them a round of applause preemptively. Okay, great. Okay, code of conduct here at CocoaHeads. The main things are if you see anyone sort of feeling uncomfortable or not having a good time, let us know about it. There's an anonymous form, or if you want, like at the time you speak to Bach, myself, Tups, Baz, just tell someone about it. Okay, we want people to have fun and feel safe here. Okay, housekeeping. If you need a pee, there's that's the pee thing, right? Go outside, past the elevators to the right. And then also if you need to leave quickly because of an emergency, same way, it's just, there's an emergency door there. We haven't had to do it yet, so that's fine. Okay, it's an online event, so no questions during the presentation unless the presenter asks, but they'll do questions at the end, and just, wait for that. We'll hand out microphones and stuff. If you're watching online, go to Slack channel, hashtag Melbourne-meetup on Slack. Great, okay. Helps the evening flow better. Interesting, flow is appropriate tonight. Okay, good. Now, thank you to our sponsors, Mantle Group. Awesome. We couldn't do it without them. Really appreciate them supporting the community. And same with REA Group. Thank you. We really need to get them out here. Yeah, clap as well, Vitor. He's on it. Okay. Some other events that are happening this month. Coding Night, Wednesday, April 16th. Next Wednesday. Okay. Hey, Rob. There's going to be a career counselor there. Maybe Tups can, so Luke Pearce, Luke Pearce. I knew we should have done that.
Luke Pearce will be, he's done it once before last year. So there's 15-minute segments. We'll be promoting it from tomorrow onwards. For next week. So he does 15-minute segments, talks about where your career is at, where you want to get to, and how to get to there. Consultation. So he uses one of the meeting rooms, and so it's in private. You're not doing it in front of everyone. And it
was very popular last time he was here.
Yes. Awesome. And the booking will be online. So if you do want to do it, check tomorrow especially and get hold of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Tups. There's also Social Night on last Tuesday a month, the 29th of April. Hoping I got that date right. Great. That's going to be at Brick Lane Brewery. Yes? Yep. Yes? Awesome. That's on Queen Street, Melbourne. Andrew, come up here. So Andrew's a supporter of the community. He's always helped us out, done great presentations. He's got some workshops coming up.
Hello. So if you haven't seen me, I'm Andrew Murphy. I do a lot of stuff around technology leadership, soft skills, people skills, kind of helping engineers be better professionals, better leaders, and better people that help other people. So I've done a bunch of presentations around Melbourne on this kind of stuff and a few internationally. But what I'm starting to do is a bunch of workshops. So in-person, full-day events where I kind of teach the skills that you can't really get to in a 30, 40-minute presentation. So it's 8 hours of communication skills, conflict resolution skills, difficult conversations, understanding the roles of leadership and how to give and receive feedback effectively. Because this community has been amazing, one of the things I want to do is give a huge discount to people who come from here, because I love speaking here, I love coming here. So if you use that discount code or that link, you'll be able to get a hugely discounted ticket. I'm running the workshops in Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, Auckland and Wellington. So if you're watching online, you might be able to find one near you if you're here in Melbourne. I'm doing them later on in June, I think. But that link has all the details.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. I will sign up. Okay. Some other groups that we support and help us out. The Sydney CocoaHeads. Thank you, Vitor. Go, buddy. GDG Melbourne as well. And then if you want to find the other CocoaHeads events, there's the AUNZ-CocoaHeads.social QR code. Scan that. You'll find out what's going on around Australia and New Zealand. How to find us specifically, go to melbournecocoaheads.com or jump on the Slack channel. In particular, #Melbourne, #Melbourne Meetup for tonight. And then Mastodon, which I don't know much about, but we're up there, you know. On Slack, tonight's Melbourne-Meetup. Melbourne-Meetup. Dash is fine? No, dash is not fine. And then #Melbourne Volunteers. If you want to help us, please help us. There's for jobs and stuff, go to #jobs. And if you want to do presentations or even suggest presentations you want to see, go to #speakers. I need to adjust that thing. Want to talk, mentoring available. Okay, we're going to kick things off with Vito Milana with Developing Optimism.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you all for giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you today. I am going to spend, I'm just going to turn my timer on so I've got more of an indication of time. I'm going to speak a bit about an area that I'm deeply passionate about, and that's positive psychology. And I've tried to forge some connections to software development and offering some hopefully practical and accessible opportunities whereby you can forge those connections into work in practice. Just a little bit about me. I've been in the psychology space for about 21 years, and I'm currently a high school teacher. I teach English and English language to senior students and some junior students at Camberwell Grammar School. And English language is sort of like entry-level linguistics. So I want to sort of touch later on about some areas in psycholinguistics and how language is important for different approaches in the sort of positive psychology space. I have published poetry and a few short stories, and Pat's added that I'm a rubber duck. I'm not quite sure what that is, but it certainly has some relevance. So let's kick things off. I should go for about 25 to 30 minutes, so hopefully there's something useful that you can take. And the other thing too is my understanding of software development is superficial. So I've got a cursory understanding that's secondary. My very good friends, some of them work in software development, and my two brothers. But that aside, I've got very little understanding. So hopefully that intersect is relevant and authentic as I sort of go through. Okay, so positive psychology. It has this sort of association that's often misinterpreted as being something that's just linked to emotions and the sort of ideas that skitter around the psychology trend. But genuinely, positive psych is all about that notion of flourishing. Now, individual flourishing and flourishing from an interdependent level has had this renaissance recently. It used to be something that was sort of seen as almost socially psychological in its foundation, but now it has a much more practical application. And a lot of organisational psychologists, my background is neuropsychology, but a lot of organisational psychologists spend a lot of time looking at how we can build flourishing as part of a practical process that really has longevity behind it. So you build skills and you have the capacity to hold on to those skills over an extended period of time. It sort of was coined in the late 90s when Martin Seligman took over the APA presidency and sort of wanted to move away from the concept of pathologizing mental illness. So he saw in the 90s that sometimes when individuals present themselves with a need for psychological intervention or just for conversation, that we need to champion those skills and we need to celebrate those skills that make them sometimes what might be seen as different. With that in mind, he came up with this sort of idea that positive psychology is what we should focus on and shift away from the sort of punitive exercises that are traditionally grounded from other models that the APA and the other organisations like the World Health Organization have adopted for decades. So that's the sort of etiology where positive psychology first was coined. It does have rich foundation in humanism, and I'm sure lots, if not all of you, recognise the sort of foundations of social psych and humanistic movements. Areas like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the wonderful work of Carl Rogers after the turn of World War II, that they were really about that, the patient-centric psychopathology and how that was sort of seen as this rumbling in psychology as needing to be a focus. Then there was a shift and there was a focus on pathology, and now thankfully about 25 years ago we've sort of gone back to the notion about has to be person-centric. It also has these really interesting connections with that broaden and build theory. And there's a lot of research out there in terms of what we mean when we think about positive emotions and how we can leverage those positive emotions to offset the negative emotions over time. So the broaden and build theory, and Fredrickson did some wonderful work with this, he was moving away from those incidental movements where you might utilise positive emotions on a consequential level. It was more about how do I sustain this and ensure that I'm equipped, I've insulated my psychology to deal with issues or concerns that might continue over a period of time. In essence, in that last point I've put, it's about building the personal resources, recognising what they are, but ensuring that they're stabilised and you have the capacity to draw upon them if the need arises. So that's sort of like a bit of a historical foundation about what positive psych is. Now, there are lots of ideas and concepts and frameworks for positive psych. The more celebrated is the PERMA model. It's been around for a while, and I'm sure you've heard maybe what PERMA is. I'm just going to go through the different elements of PERMA with a focus on software developing and how these skills are transferable to the organisational capacity. I've also got a couple of ideas in terms of neuropsychopathology and how that has that interesting link between the two. I then want to finalise with a discussion on flow state and how flow state, over the past 50 years since its original coinage, has had the capacity to link into the PERMA model and have real practical applicability in the workforce and certainly in the world of programming and coding. So just as a snapshot, PERMA is an initialism for positive, and in particular positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So I want to go through each of those with some ideas and how that might be transferable in your professional and personal lives too. Great. So P is for positive emotion. Now, when we think about positive emotion, it's about celebrating the small wins. It's about not undercutting the importance of those minor successes, or maybe revisiting what minor successes look like in terms of a language perspective, And some of the examples might be, and I apologise if they seem flippant, but maybe fixing a bug or completing a module. We know through research over the past really 2 decades that it does have this capacity to boost emotion and boost motivation. And both those ideas are drawn from a social psychological capacity, but also a psychoneuro-immunological one. So we do see those improvements on 2 different trains of thought. PFCs are really powerful when we think about positive emotions, those positive feedback cultures. They're powerful in the workplace, and they have the capacity for workers to draw upon those skills and take them to their personal lives. So that versatility and flexibility is championed by psychologists in terms of what it can offer and have the capacity to extend. They are all about that notion of self-efficacy as well. So that idea that as a member of a group, you have the capacity and the power to make a change, and that interconnection with the group leads to more improved outcomes. So self-efficacy, when you look at research, it has one of the highest meta-analytical scores in terms of its capacity to engender genuine and authentic change. Also, I thought about the notion of gamification and its capacity in a positive emotion framework in the world of programming and coding. So ideas like gamified tools are really important and quite successful when we think about the importance of preserving our well-being for the better. I've put there 2 ideas, points and badges, whether they be physical and tangible or whether they're more intrinsic in the way they're awarded. The important thing is, underscoring all this is cultural change. And sometimes having gamification opportunities might be seen as tokenistic. So it's about developing cultural practices that recognise and celebrate those gamified tools and other elements of gamification in a way that's seen as useful and respected in an organisation. And there's some really interesting organisational psychologists in the past 5 years or so that have done increasing ideas about gamification, and there's even more stuff coming out in terms of how AI can be used to work alongside gamification. There's a professor at Melbourne Uni, Professor Hopfenbacher, and she does incredible research in terms of AI and gamification and its natural links to psychology. All right, moving on. E is for engagement in the PERMA model. Engagement is different to what it might be represented in its sort of, in its dictionary form. It's about full immersion. It's about that absorption in an activity that's authentic and that's promoted and understood as being deep practice. When I get to the end of the PERMA and I start to very quickly refer to flow state, you can form this natural association between the E and that flow state too. So while they're mutually independent trains of thought, there is this connection between the two which I want to draw upon. How do we achieve this engagement in terms of this immersive nature? Optimization of work environments. And it's something that we all try to put into practice. Ideas like minimizing distractions, and while it's contentious, that removal of unnecessary meetings. I work in a school. I've recently shifted to a new school where there are very few meetings, and the ideas behind that was that productivity increased and students were more engaged. And I'm finding that seems to be a practice that's genuine. So that removal of unnecessary meetings is something that is highly regarded in the positive psychology narrative as being an important feature of promotion and self-wellbeing and success. There are questions. What do I mean by necessary? What is a meeting? What sort of medium do the meetings occur? And they're areas that, again, I'm happy to share with Pat, there's some really interesting research that's coming out about different sort of meetings and how we accommodate using different platforms too. Lots of research out there about goals and how goals can lend to engagement. Generally, the research suggests that as long as goals have manageable chunks and clear objectives, then there can be that element of success. And then I've put in there, this is my sort of link to programming, but I did read about Google's 20% policy. So they encourage passion projects, and it's something that fits sort of naturally into the engagement process as well. So encouraging workers to engage in practices that might be their own sort of driving force. It might be linked to their professional practice, or it might be something that's more less professionally organised. Okay, relationships. And it was so great hearing Andrew's introduction before, because this is something that I'm truly passionate about, and I'd love to get Andrew actually into our school, so I might chat after this about, doing conflict resolution. So relationships is probably the most dense area in PERMA literature. It's because we involve fundamentally more than one person, and I'm going to talk about very briefly the barrier of relationships, which is the conflict stuff. So it's two ideas when we think about relationships. It's strength and it's support. And that intersect between the two is so important for that word I used earlier on, that notion of flourishing. It is one of the areas that's often overlooked in the busyness of the workday. So a lot of HR departments and organisational consultants in psychology look at ways to mend relationships, but also how to solidify and build those relationships in practice. There's a question mark there, but I did find that capacity in programming, so something about mob programming as having an opportunity to foster collaboration in an authentic sense. And those wonderful team building exercises, when they're not done to a point that they become redundant and unnecessary, but they're in a way that's meaningful and they're in a way that's celebrated. Things like tonight, CocoaHeads, and other social events that Pat projected earlier on too. So with relationships, there's that natural barrier that occurs sometimes, and that's that notion of conflict. I've done some conflict resolution training in my work through psychology, and one thing I find useful is that sense of empowerment and giving individuals the capacity to experience sometimes really empowering and important and sometimes short workshops and seminars about how to manage conflict. And the research shows that those are really successful. There's a famous text there, People Skills by Robert Bolton, originally from the 80s. I highly recommend it in terms of its accessibility and the way that Bolton projects the need for conflict resolution in a way that's very patterned and digestible. He focuses on different areas such as listening and active listening in particular, and the power of body language when looking at conflict resolution. I'd like to see some sort of an update, given that a lot of meetings and that are now not necessary, and conflict might not necessarily be face to face, but this is still, it still has this, this groundswell, especially introductory psychological courses, as a necessary text. With body language, he focuses on things like paralinguistic features, prosody, so intonation and tone and tenor and pitch and speed, all those wonderful speech connectors that drive communication, and the necessary, the importance behind those in managing and sometimes diffusing conflict in different ways. We're nearly there. So M is for meaning. Meaning has sort of like this elusive quality about it when you sort of hear it out of context. In coding, it's about that genuine feeling that your work has purpose and that sort of drive to gestaltism, that it's part of something large. Without that meaning, this whole process of positive psych tends to fracture and crumble very, very quickly. It's one of the solidifying forces for success in positive psych. Lots of really great research on the psychology of worth and self-esteem. So again, I can share readings, and I highly recommend, if you've got time, to look at some of those areas. And I did have a quick look last week, and there's some really rich literature out there that actually focuses on programming and coding in terms of developing, establishing, and sustaining meaning. It's that recognizing that your work impacts the end users of the organisation. The mission-driven projects is an area that fascinates me. So research suggests that in order to get meaning into a place that's reliable and relevant, that all tasks need to have some extension of the mission of an organisation, or the value system, or the motto. Once that becomes part of the narrative, then meaning flourishes. So there's some interesting reading and work around that as well. And then that shared volunteering framework is another area that builds our meeting. And that's more, I guess, primarily a team-based intrinsic reward system. And it's the idea that volunteering as a group helps the overall group and the capacity for success. The neuropsychological benefits are far-reaching. So there's lots of stuff in terms of those precursors to serotonin and other sorts of neurotransmitters and neuroadapters that have those spikes and also the longevity over time when we engage in a volunteering system. Even in short volunteering bursts as well, which I find really interesting. Lucky last, and it's apt that the last letter in the PERMA model is accomplishment, because it is about effectively when we move to that final product. The important thing to note when we think about accomplishment, that it's not interchangeable with that notion of achievement. There is some mild intersect, but they're different in terms of their psychological and philosophical properties. Accomplishment is about that sense of mastery. And what mastery looks like has subjective nuances associated with it. It doesn't have this objectivity that a lot of the other qualities sometimes have. But mastery is a really interesting area, and it's an important part in terms of that model of PERMA and achieving that positive psychological state. To get that, the research values milestones. Working on projects that have clear phases and objectives. And in this sort of field, that recognition program only works if it's culturally valued. And cultural appreciation and immersion into a culture can take months, it can take years in order for, I guess, full acceptability and full practice. Skill development opportunities are almost a mandate. They're a non-negotiable when we think about accomplishment in PERMA. Irrespective of entry, irrespective of a person's capacity, there always needs to be skill development in terms of preserving that positive psychology and that wellness that it produces. I'm right on time. I wanted 20 minutes on that, and I got to 20 minutes, so that's good. All right, so now I want to talk about just a sort of a much shorter segment, that notion of flow state. And I've heard Patrick talk about flow before, and it got me thinking about it is an area in positive psych, and it's an area that has this natural extension to the PERMA model, and in particular that engagement sphere. All right. Now, I can't produce this wonderful American-Hungarian psychologist's surname, but it's Mikhail, C, and he coined this, I tried, he coined this 50 years ago this year. So while flow seems to have this almost 21st century, the sort of first quarter 21st century appearance, its roots, its foundations are 50 years ago. And Mikhail suggested that that notion of deep work, that immersion is so fundamental for a person's individual psychological well-being. At the time, it was coined mental hygiene, but now it's about wellness. It's about that personal satisfaction and about resilience, which I haven't really talked about. And because of that, it does have that capacity to extend that E-sphere in the PERMA model. For flow to work, there are conditions, and the beauty about the flow state from a psych perspective is the flexibility, that elasticity that we can sort of apply to that psychological framework. The conditions and the goals that are set in the flow state are time sensitive. They only work once we have time parameters set. And I want to go back to that in a second. The notion of immediate feedback is also an area that helps, and to coin a term that I've heard, to stay in the flow. Without that immediacy, the flow state becomes severed pretty quickly. Now, what the feedback looks like, what the notion of immediacy is, it synonymous with brevity perhaps, that's where organisations and individuals within teams form those clear conjunctions early on in the process. This notion of balance between challenge and skill, so I've sort of extracted what I found was perhaps most useful in the wonderful world of programming. That challenge and skill has a history back to the early 1900s, and it's driven by that Yerkes-Dodson effect. So it's that inverted U where we need to be mildly aroused in order for flow state to work and in order for success to prevail. If we're under-aroused, so that sort of left-hand side of the inverted U, boredom is the result. If we're over-aroused, then we fall into the risk of acute stress and that notion of, I forgot the word, what was I trying to say? That notion of burnouts. When we've got those two areas, and in the 1900s it was referred to as stress, now we think about it in terms of arousal, we need to find that happy medium where we function optimally while still having that element of arousal to progress. The examples I've put there where we lose sight of the flow because we're falling in the outskirts, the sort of periphery of that middle zone, a junior developer who might be allocated a complex task may fall into that right-hand side. It might lead to those notions of burnout or those heightened stress. And on the other side of the spectrum, a senior developer that's assigned easier tasks might sort of skirt into that notion of boredom. Now, I know there's obviously complexities and there's nuances associated with those two examples, but generally as a model that works, it's about working on tasks that fit the individual and the team and ensuring that there is that excitement, that there's that arousal that's linked to those particular projects. Okay, there are practical applications of flow. So this is more the conditions, the theoretical practices. This is the practice of flow. Those do not disturb modes are imperative. And whether they're physical in terms of signage or whatever other ways they're produced, or whether they're more intrinsic in their application. Again, sort of reverbing back to the E for PERMA, that optimization of the work environment, ergonomic setups, tools that enhance productivity, which might mean spending a bit of money sometimes. They're areas that build that practical application, and flow is what ultimately becomes championed. And again, building a culture that encourages deep work, and that takes time. Time blocking, lots of really interesting research about the psychology of time and how time blocking has almost as powerful a mechanism for intervention as client-practitioner interaction, which is really interesting in terms of the force of time blocking in the organisational psychology world. And then a technique which I'm sure you all are familiar with, and that's the Pomodoro technique, which I'm not going to read, but it's just on the screen there. But that notion of being very diligent and practiced and incisive in how we allocate time in order to engage and engender that sense of flow. And that cycle is important too, because these are ideas in positive psych, like I had earlier on, about developing skills and finding the resources that are sustainable over time. Perfect. All right, the benefits of flow. We know, and this is, I've tried to capture it in a programming paradigm. We know that flow increases productivity, both intrapersonally and interdependently. It has the capacity for problem solving to be expedient. In context, that might look like writing cleaner and more efficient code, or other sort of projects that have that more group and teamwork-driven process. From a more pure psychological metric, that greater satisfaction is something that almost naturally occurs when we engage in purposeful flow. The flow state is intrinsically rewarding. It leads to heightened job satisfaction and reduced burnout. And then I imagine innovation in coding is quite an important area. So research shows that it does actually improve creativity. And what creativity looks like can be organisationally laden, or it could be something that's more intrinsically in terms of its motivation too. Okay, so just to summarise the two together and what are sort of the take-home messages for programming. The PERMA model, it's been around for about 35 years and it's gaining traction more and more in organisational psychological systems. It does boost and promote well-being. It helps with engagement and teamwork. And so it's got far-reaching benefits when we think about those two groups, those two ideals. And it builds that sense of purpose and mastery in programming and coding. The flow state is an extension. It helps improve focus, productivity, and it leads to better programming outcomes. Generally, by integrating these sort of concepts, and these are conceptual with practical foundations, into work, the technical performance improves, but also you're able to insulate your own psychological well-being and be able to almost intrinsically draw upon those resources when needed. So it has this remarkable flexibility from a practical and also personal objective. I just want to finish, I've got 1 minute left, great. I just want to finish, go back a sec. I am a huge David Bowie fan, and when David Bowie died a few years ago at 69 years of age, on his deathbed, he wrote a letter to his long-term friend, the famed actor Gary Oldman. And David Bowie was known for his irreverence and his wonderful capacity to engage audiences. He was also a champion of positive psychology. And he had lots to say about psychology and what it did for his life. So I thought, what better way to end this presentation than show, which is a little bit macabre now that I'm thinking of it, a dying man's last words and how that reflects his life from a positive psychological basis. So I'm going to read, it's not too long, but I will read it because I think it's worth hearing. I'm going to die. I know there are a few months left until the end of my earthly experience. What do? I despair. I go into depression. I reject the idea of death and pretend that the disease does not exist. Or I decide to win over death. I decide with my soul because only the soul and the heart give me the inspiration to compose music as I did for 50 years. I briefly count the hours and, as the doctors tell me, I can foresee with a minimum interval the date of my death, and the launch of my new and last job is set for January 8, 2016, the day I will turn 69. I work day and night. I have time to compose, perfect, perform, record in the studio, and make videos. I do it as soon as possible because I don't want my face to glimpse the death that, taunting, is mowing down my body without me being able to defend myself. But I challenge you, death. Fuck if I don't challenge you. I challenged and won the fanatic world of the 70s with pride of ambiguity. I loved men and women. I was a man. I was a woman. An alien and finally a celestial body. What can you do, death, against my eternity, my genius, my madness, my creativity, my music that will live forever? And the final segment. I'm Lazarus, torn by scars. I will die in the body, but I will live forever through my music. I lived long enough to receive happy birthday wishes. I thought I wouldn't be able to see my album released. I survived January 8 and you, my dear killer, lost. Just think that if you hadn't knocked on my door, my jobs would have been 24. I would even have managed to live 100 years, and instead, thanks to you, I'm 25. You know, I will be free as a bird. And how prophetic's that line, I lived long enough to receive happy birthday wishes. So just as a take-home message, from a champion of positive psychology, we can see echoed in his final words that meaning and purpose. there's that real genuine and authentic sense of resilience and acceptance, which is probably the most challenging moment where acceptance is necessary. And then we can see those glimpses through comedic prose and his genuine good nature, where positive emotions and gratitude surface. I've gone over, but thank you, that's it. Questions?
Any questions? No?
Yes?
Thank you. That was great preso. I wanted to think about the letter M, mastery. That was kind of the most loose kind of definition. And in our industry, one of the big problems is imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of related. So you can have someone who's high performing and psychologically happy, but maybe they're suffering imposter syndrome. How do you deal with that? How do you diagnose and help someone suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing, it's a really great question. Imposter syndrome it cross-fertilizes across most organizations, which I find interesting. So in the world of education, which is where I'm currently at, imposter syndrome is rife. When I did alcohol rehabilitation work many years ago in counselling, and likewise, it was quite prevalent there too. It's about, and the research shows it's about ownership, so recognising that imposter syndrome does exist. And once you normalise the process, and there's those discussions about it, there tends to be an ease of that sometimes overbearing tension and recognition that I'm okay, that this is something that I am actually proficient in, and I can move towards mastery. The other idea about mastery is it's sometimes quite distant, and that's okay too. So PERMA celebrates that you don't have to be necessarily masterful in everything. Sometimes good enough is good enough. So finding that balance between what I'm doing is great, I'll get to mastery at one point or close to it, and that imposter syndrome is something that affects most of us. My own personal experience now, I know nothing about programming, yet I've got something to share that hopefully has some sort of connection. I'm comfortable with that, and that builds my overall capacity to be well. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions?
Yep, one on the left.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's fantastic. I've gotten a lot out of it. I was wondering, regarding the first point, positivity, there's a lot of points there that, for example, gamification, they touch on a delicate subject around intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Do you have any thoughts on how to avoid the pitfalls of extrinsic motivation, where someone will, do something just for the sake of being rewarded as opposed to enjoying the task itself?
That's a good question. With intrinsic motivation, there's the idea that if you have, and this is where it works a lot in organisational side too, having someone actually present about the benefits of intrinsic motivation, because what happens is, with extrinsic, we get clouded by the tangible. So sometimes we might hear things and get seduced by the rewards that are associated. When you actually hear stories about the power of intrinsic motivation, and you can see it in practice, people tend to remember that. And so they adopt some of those processes and those views, and they become more mindful and able to enjoy the intrinsic motivation that exists. So I think the simple answer is actually hearing the experiences. And there's so many out there about how they work and how they sort of have the capacity to engender change just by listening. In the Bolton text, which I presented too, he touches on that notion of hearing the stories of others and how that can change a person's psychology. And that is an extension of intrinsic motivation too. But you're right, sometimes we tend to be swamped with the tangible, and sometimes that becomes almost secondary. So it's about championing it, finding that equality between those two processes. Yeah, which again, it's a cultural, that sometimes that cultural shift, because we're inherently change resistors, and sometimes building that cultural change makes a difference too. Yeah. Thanks, Nick. I rarely do talks, by the way, so this is a little intimidating, but go for it.
It's great stuff. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
This will challenge your positive mindset. Do you agree with the theory that the world has been going to shit since David Bowie died?
That's a good point. Interesting. So I was reading a lot of feedback about, because I had to extract his final, his dying words, and the sort of feedback at the end about how lives have changed profoundly after his death, even years on, because now we're approaching 9 years, that things have sort of deteriorated. So I think there's he was all about that celestial intervention, and I think, there's a little star that's certainly died, and things are a little bit darker. Yeah, absolutely. I hope we've got a lot of David Bowie fans in here, hopefully. Maybe.
Anything else?
It's a great question.
Clap. We clap now?
Thank you.
Yay, it's good to be back. Are we getting mic through Bok? Yes. Yep, cool. Okay, the girl and the Swift test. Before we get stuck in, a little bit about me for all the new faces. I am Amy, pronouns are she and her. Website cuteios.dev. Mastodon amy@iosdev.social. Work these days is Orderly Meds, which is a health tech wellness platform. And as well as that, I do my own project, which is a cycling-based journaling app called Ride Journal. Now, Swift testing. This is what we're going to have a bit of a look at tonight. Going to look at what is a test, the test macro, expect, require, suite, which is grouping, common test traits, tags, which need a bit of a extra explanation, async tests, test scope, and if anyone was on today's socials, they would probably have heard the Swift test evolution around attachments is now approved, so that's something coming soon. Okay, what is a test? Now, this particular talk is not a discussion on architecture or design patterns. Not going to say this is how you should structure your code or anything like that. There are no assumptions on IDE or CI environment. So a test is something that is repeatable. You can just keep running it and running it and running it, and it'll get the same result. Reproducible, same thing, get the same result. Idempotent, meaning that all of the setup, teardown is independent of any external factors, which, you know, it's just good testing practice. So let's get stuck in. Test. Test is pretty much the thing you'll be working with day to day. Documentation link from Apple. Apple's documentation is actually really, really good. Surprisingly, touch wood, because people know Apple's documentation historically has been a bit lacking, but this being a lot more modern and a lot more community driven is pretty up to date. So a long time ago on the internet, this is how we wrote tests. Anyone remember this sort of days of iOS, Mac OS development? Few nods. Woo! Making Tim Oliver happy, even though he's over in Tokyo. Yep. I miss Tokyo. Tokyo is awesome. In joke. Okay. What was I going to say about this one? Here we've just got a lot of setup, teardown. We're using a mocking framework because Objective-C allowed us to do some really, really funky stuff with messaging and objects that allowed for pretty much swapping things in and out as you go, which you don't get as much in Swift. Translating this to say something from year and a half ago, you would be writing tests like this. This is all in Swift, but you're still using XC test in there. So you've got your asserts, your expectations, all of that stuff in order to see what the actual test and the behavior is. Again, this is a bit more convoluted. You're having to remember what these particular Objective-C bridge to Swift things are. And now we get to test as the macro itself. So trying to remember when macros were introduced. It was it 2021? Around that era. We've had them for a while, which is actually quite remarkable. Part of Swift 5, I'm pretty sure. I'm probably going to get corrected on this one, but let's just go with that sort of time. What we have here is we're defining a function as a test using the test macro. Then within it, we've got these expectations. So using the expect macro to go, we want this thing to be true, which is what we have. So I've got a couple of expressions there which produce a Boolean result. And that is, at its most basic level, what a test is. Now you can just throw this function into a file as part of your test target or your test package, and it will work. As long as you're importing testing, away you go, and you've got yourself a test. But if that's all it was, we'll be a bit lacking on what we can do. So let's look at an example of one with all the trimmings. So here we've got this test which runs through some code, providing a few different inputs and some expected outputs. Those inputs and outputs are there as part of the arguments, which is taking two arrays, zipping it together. So you've got first 0th element in the first array, 0 in the second array, so on and so forth as your arguments to this function. Oh, bugger off, Siri. That's what you've got, which you're defining in the test macro and also in the function you're declaring. And then you get to use them in your test body itself. So you can go, cool, let's need to actually see what's there. Pretty much it's doing a setup and going, okay, once I've run all of this condition, is my expected output going to match what's there? And yay, it is. Here we've got something that's repeatable, it is reproducible, it is idempotent, all the good things that a test needs to be. As well as that, if you're familiar with Xcode, and I'm going to break my rule about mentioning specific IDEs, but typically the name of the test that you take from gets taken from the actual function. Back in XC test days, it was test something, something, something. Here it is just something, but you can modify that in the macro. So you've got here show next walkthrough step, which is pretty cool because that's a much more descriptive title to our test than what we're naming the function. We can also provide some traits there, which are tags. In this case, we are saying this particular test is tagged as a walkthrough test, and you can do some nice things with tags as well. So we've got our test, which is just our sort of vanilla test, and then we've got one which is all the trimmings. Pretty cool. Next thing to cover is expect. So again, Apple's documentation, I'll leave it up for a little bit if you want to take a picture of it or just rely on the stream. It's all pretty cool. But there are two real flavors of expect, being you expect a condition to be true, which is the top example. We've just sort of going, we want this stuff to produce a Boolean true result, but you can also expect a particular closure to throw. So in this case, we are wanting the function. I'm omitting all of the setup around it, so we not worrying about the inputs there, but we're expecting the output of calling that function to throw an error. Now, this is pretty good, and yeah, it works. I like it. So we can test a true condition, and we can also test that an exception gets thrown, which is fairly common in Swift-based apps. Next one is require. If you look at the documentation link here, it's actually the one for expectations, so you expect macro. Require is just very similar, so they've put it in the same documentation. What required does is it'll actually stop execution if the particular condition has not been met. With expect, your flow of execution continues. It just shows an error. With require, it will go, I do not want to do anything more if this condition is not met. So here, what we're doing is we're using it like we would XC test unwrap to unwrap an optional value and make use of the result. So in this case, if that's nil, it will result in a thrown error and your execution will stop. Next one is suite, which is another macro. Here, Apple's documentation is called organizing tests. Makes a bit of sense because you can have standalone tests in a function in a file, that's all well and good. But sometimes you want to group them together, form a bit of a hierarchy. That's what suite is for. So here you apply the suite macro to a structure which is a value type. And then within that, you define all of your tests. The beauty of suite is that you can actually nest all of these. So within a suite, you can have a suite, you can have a suite, and it's turtles all the way down, which is pretty cool. Messy, but pretty cool. The other benefit here is quite often you would have the tradition, whether it's good or bad, I'm not going to say, tradition of naming your test type, the type you're wanting to test, and then appending tests. By applying a name to the suite macro, by applying a name to the suite macro, you can then name it whatever you want. So in that way, if you wanted, you can actually remove your grouping of tests from the actual test type itself. I'm still a bit more stuck in my ways because I'm old. Don't ask how old, I just am. In that I will always use, say, test subject and group based on the type. You don't have to, you can group based on whatever you want, which is pretty cool. All of these things allow you to be very expressive in how you write your tests. Next one we're going to look at is test traits. So, what is a trait? Trait can be something like a tag. It can be whether a test is enabled or disabled based on a particular Boolean condition. You can also set a time limit on the tests, but let's be honest, if your test's taking longer than about 2 or 3 seconds, you're probably doing something wrong. Yep. Yes, let's not talk about measurement tests. They're allowed to take as long as you want, but for a basic testing of a unit, if it's taking longer than a few seconds, there's something else going on. You can use time limit here to pretty much cancel a test if it goes over a period of time. If you're paying by the minute for a CI service, such as Xcode Cloud, this might be useful if you've got tests that are not nice. We'll leave it at that. You can also have a bug tag. Calling it a tag's a bit of a misnomer. It is a trait where you just say, this particular test belongs to a bug. Here is your identifier for the bug in whatever bug tracking system you want. Again, all of these allow for you to be super expressive in how you write your tests, how you determine meaning and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. Next one, tags. So I mentioned it just before. Showing it again because documentation is its own little thing with its own caveats. In order to define a tag, you do an extension on the tag type. It does need to be an extension when you define it. Just using the macro doesn't work. Apple's documentation is very explicit about this. So you define the extension, then you define a static variable, type self, and you use the tag macro. Then when you get to using it, when you define your test, you say tags, here are my list of tags such as journaling and system, and away you go. And it works really, really well. Advantage of doing this is it provides another form of grouping and identification on your on what you run. If you're using something like Xcode and Xcode Cloud, you can set up a test plan. Those test plans allow you to specify and filter tests based on different tags, and those tags then, you can go, here's my test plan for running everything that's system related or journaling related, and only run a subset of those tags. Async tests. Now, this quite often is where a lot of people run into issues, because Combine is its own world of pain to test. Not going to talk about it. But so is Swift concurrency, in that quite often you want to have your execution or your tests handled in a particular way. So let's look at an example. Here what we've got is we're expecting that once the on appear of this particular view model has been called, we want a values count to be 1. Pretty straightforward. What's slightly different here is that the loading of those pictures happens asynchronously. So we've mocked out the repository. In this case is our data access to Swift data or whatever else you have, and it's using that by providing a completion handler. This is all getting into the way I structure this particular app, but as part of that it's going, we'll wait for this confirmation before doing any continuation of flow within the function. And that particular confirmation happens within something else that is called asynchronously. So it won't actually get down to the expect macro until that confirmation is called. This is pretty cool to make sure that all of the conditions for your test are set up by the point you get to that expect, which is what you're actually wanting to test. Apple's documentation here is pretty good, covers a few different conditions around what the actual confirmation function expects. So you can go, I want it to be called once, many times, up to a number of times, whatever condition you want. Test scoping. So Swift 6.1, which was released a couple of weeks ago, introduced what's called test scoping. Test scoping is itself a test trait. I haven't gotten to play around with this too much. So the example here is from Apple's documentation. So here, got the test being set up. Then we've got the type, which is conforming to test traits and test scoping. As part of that protocol definition, you need to do, what is it called? The provide scope function, which takes in your test line, test file, and also the body of the test. And within that provide scope, a way to conceptualize it is like your setup and your tear down methods back in XCTest, where you're needing to do a whole heap of construction around your test in order to make it idempotent, and then tear it down at the end. this is what you're doing here. The example makes use of a singleton, which we all know, well, I assume we all know the bad ideas around global state and its mutability, but what we have here is current is a task local variable. So we can set it with a value, execute a particular task, in which case we have here our test, and then it all gets torn down at the end, which is pretty cool. This is a nice way to isolate your tests and make sure any setup and teardown are reusable. And it's also going to be reusable across particular test suites or tests themselves, because it's not bound to the init of a value type, which is previously the preferred way of doing setup for a test. Attachments is today's very fun announcement. Now, in XCTest, there's XCT attachment, I think. If anyone's done XCUI tests and captured screenshots via it, I believe, don't hold me to it, that this is an example of XCT attachment. Attachments is the new Swift test way of achieving that. So its purpose is for, say, a CI environment. When the environment fails or where a test fails, you often want a little bit more than just a log message going, this did it not equal that. Sometimes you want to get what was the setup conditions and other things around it. Attachments will allow you to do that, which is pretty cool. I like it. I'll probably play around with it. May or may not have a good use for it, but I expect, I'm going to assume and guess that something like attachments will have a dub video. Hopefully, it's kind of that timing. Did I mention it was 61 days until dub.dc? Okay, that's it for the talk.
Thanks, Amy. That was really great. Learned a lot from that. What would you say are some of the benefits of Swift testing against kind of XC tests, and what are some of the hindrances of problems you've run into with Swift testing?
Oh, Swift testing and its differences to XC test. If I can, I will always default to Swift testing, mainly because as a paradigm, it suits my style and the way I write apps and write code. XC test is a lot more procedural in that it's sort of like, do this, expect that, do that, expect that. Whereas Swift test is a lot more expressive, and even though it's describing a unit that you're typically testing, it feels a lot more behavioural in how you actually write the tests. That's my experience with it. As always, pick whichever solution is going to suit the app you're writing and the team you're a part of, but I err towards Swift testing for those reasons.
Would you migrate old tests, or would you just leave them and just start write new tests in Swift testing?
Again, this is what is the capacity of your team question. I, in my own personal projects, just go, nope, rewriting them, away I go. I'll spend a day, whatever it takes to migrate across. If you're in a larger organisation, app that's been there for a couple of years, many, many developers, doing a clean cut from XC test to Swift test may not work. The advantage of something like Xcode is they can live together. Even within, say, a Swift test or suite, you can still use XC test expectations and all that. So you don't need to go all the way to Swift testing at once. You can do it gradually.
Yeah, it's been maybe a few years since I've done some serious Swift testing, and so a lot of that's like I don't know what they call it, selectors in Swift, like the hashtag expectation is new, and it looks really like powerful and awesome. So back when I used XC test case, I would use Nimble a lot for matches, just because the built-in ones weren't really powerful. So can you do like similar kinds of things, like this match this array in any order and that kind of stuff? Can you do that with
Oh, okay. A brief history of testing and Swift in about 30 seconds. So back in 2014 when Swift was first announced, during that dub is when the Quick and Nimble project started. Back at that point in time, behavioural-driven testing and BDD, behavioural-driven development, was all the rage. So people wanted to go, yay, we have now this expressive language. If people remember pre-1.0 Swift, it's, yep, okay, sidetracked. That's where it came from. Now, along with that, all of these matches sprung up because that was the style of coding at the time, and those matches match a bit more closely to the, I'm going to call it funkiness of Objective-C, which is you're able to do things like mocking and do assertions based on the amount of times a particular message is sent or method is called quite well in Objective-C. So they were trying to emulate that in that behavioural style a lot. Can you then reproduce that in Swift testing? Sorry, not as much, because how you write those tests is going to be slightly different, in that you're not going to go this dot matches that. You're going to go, here's a Boolean expression. Am I expecting it to be true, or am I expecting this closure to throw an exception? So slightly different. I think Swift test is a little bit more expressive than the BDD style of Quick and Nimble. Having said that, I believe Quick and Nimble are still maintained. They're just not as common in practice.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess it's always better to use the kind of first-party stuff built into Swift or Xcode. Just because I remember using Quick and found that it didn't integrate perfectly with Xcode's test runner and things like that. So
oh yeah.
If there's a way to, it looks like it's quite expressive now, and
yep.
Yeah, definitely
like,
want to check it out.
I remember one of the big pain points around Quick and Nimble in the early days was when you ran the tests, you could not run an individual test. You had to run everything within the test target, just because of the way it did all of its new stuff. To do a complete and utter tangent, you mentioned @selector, which is an Objective-C macro, which is very different from a Swift macro in its style, kind of, but Swift macro is a lot more powerful than the old @selector the shorthand syntax for dictionary and array, which we at curly bracket, at square bracket, and all of that. So even though they're both macros of a variation, it's probably not quite as good to do a one-to-one with them. They're different approaches, same terminology.
Any more questions? Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Awesome. Thank you, Amy. One more round of applause for Vito and Amy. Thank you. Awesome. Great work. Oh, that was Amy sitting there. Just a reminder about coding night and Luke Pierce, baby. Where's Tups? Tups is... Yeah. Okay, there you are. Hidden. Yep. Not me. Yep. Luke Pierce will be there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll be there coding, most likely. CocoaHeads Social Night on Tuesday, 29th of April. Might not be there, but yeah, we'll see. And thanks again to our sponsors, Mantle Group and REA Group. Give them another round of applause. Great. What a good CocoaHeads that was. Okay, awesome. We're going to go to the Mitre Tasman up the road. Please join us if you want. Thank you for coming. Great, awesome. All right, thanks for joining.